Hello again. Welcome back, Doubts Aloud listener, or more hopefully out there. We're into another episode. Now, you may remember that we had one called the perfect episode. And so to counteract that or continue from that, we've got the simple episode or the simplicity episode. And it's going to be very simple, isn't it, Ed and Francis?
Yep.
Yes.
But before we find out what this simple episode is actually about, there is a bit of feedback because we had John Nelson on several times on this podcast, and we had him on not long ago, and he came to speak at our discussion group up in the city. This is our second one we've held back live in the city since the pandemic, so it was great to have a good crowd actually. So it really has shown that we can pick up again and carry on with this sort of inner city London discussion. So, Ed, can you give a bit of feedback on what happened?
Well, what I loved was he brought all his mates from Oxford. So there were some old friends like Josh Parikh was there, and all these really clever people. And it sounded like they were really interested in what he had to say. And the material was pretty similar to what everyone's heard if they listened to our last episode. So that aspect was brilliant, but not newsworthy.
Right. Yeah. Basically, just tapping into the nature of the Gospels and different, backdrop to how the Gospels were formed and what they were, and it was pretty fascinating, really. Yeah. And it was good chats afterwards, and it was really good, sort of, getting into the flow in 2023 for our discussion group. So it was. It was really, really good. And so I look forward to the next one.
Which will be the self-same Josh.
Yes.
Christian thinker and apologist and everything.
Yeah. What's it going to be on, Ed? What's going to be the topic?
He
I think it was open when I was there, what it was going to be. Yeah.
There's a debate that you're very familiar with, like with Tom Stark and people like that, talking about the what we would call atrocities described in the Old Testament.
That's right.
And Josh has picked up the fluidity of a movement of how that issue isn't settled in apologetics.
Yes. Yeah,
he's putting that as almost as an example in a wider chat about different kinds of approaches to apologetics.
Yeah.
So he's standing back a bit.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I had a very good talk with Josh there, and he's changed a lot since he first came to our group, funny enough, which was about 6 years ago. Yeah. And I talked to him on various subjects, and he's made quite a radical shift in many areas. And this is what happens when you do apologetic defenses. You end up sort of moving around all over the place.
Well, it sounds like we're doing a plug. So best thing is to find us on Meetup. Meetup.com, and it's the London Unbelievable Discussion Group, and the night is Monday the 13th of February in a pub quite near Euston Station, 7 p.m.
Okay, so let's move on to the simple episode. Yeah, it's not that simple. It has to have some words.
Okay, well, let's start with Occam's razor.
Occam's razor was, when I was taught about it, the sort of simple rubric was entities are not needlessly to be multiplied, which isn't quite word for word what he said, but I think it's a nice kind of brief summary of what he said, and it can be phrased in various ways, but generally the simplest, the most parsimonious explanation is to be preferred to a more complicated explanation. Occam is named after a philosopher who was called William of Occam, and he was a philosopher, I believe, at Oxford. And I'm just trying to remember what century it was in. It was back 14th. In the day, anyway.
He was born on the 13th, but he would have been a child when the 14th century.
Right. Okay. Yes. Well, he wasn't. I don't think he was said to be an infant genius. So yeah. Anyway, he was. we get the time frame roughly. I gather, and I think we've got we're going to have a link to the In Our Time podcast on Occam, and which discusses Occam's razor, for which he's mainly famous. But it seems that Occam developed his principle, at least in part, in reaction to the teachings of another very famous and highly regarded philosopher called Duns Scotus. And he thought the
yes. When I heard Scotus, I thought they were talking about the Supreme Court of the United States.
Well, when I was typing out my entry for our show notes, it auto-corrected to that. I mean, I didn't realise that until I sort of went back and read it, and I thought, I don't remember typing that in capitals, but it obviously auto-corrected to capitals. But yes, it's Duns Scotus, which I believe refers to the fact that he was from Scotland, I think.
Oh, okay.
And he had a theory which was a metaphysical theory about identity and about universals. So a universal was like, we are humans. So you and Andrew and I all share a human nature, but we at the same time are in some way separate. So what is it that at the same time joins us all, and how do we distinguish so that we are separate? And he had this, Duns Scotus said there was this metaphysical quality of having humanity, but there was also this quality, which I'm probably going to get the pronunciation wrong, called something like haxiety, which meant that each one of us was an individual. So there were sort of like several things going on here. You know, there was this universal of having humanity, of having a sort of human essence, but also our essence of individuality. And that it was in reaction to that, in part, that Occam developed this idea of keeping things very simple.
Yeah, it makes intuitive sense for sure.
That's right. Yes,
and
I mean it is sometimes spoken of as if it were a rule of reasoning, you know, as if it were a logical proof of some sort, or a rule of logic, but it's not a rule of logic. There's no logical reason why a complicated answer invoking a number of entities couldn't be the right answer, when the simpler answer invoking fewer entities might turn out to be the wrong answer. But I think intuitively we just sense that if you don't need something in your explanation, rationally it's better to leave it out. And I think it is worth bearing in mind that to be reasonable and rational isn't necessarily the same as being right. You know, you can believe the right thing for irrational reasons. It can turn out that you're right, and you can have very rational reasons for believing the wrong thing. You may, you know, your logic and your evidence may be, your logic may be perfect. Your evidence may seem strong, but it may turn out, you know, as you develop more, as you find more evidence, that in fact you were wrong.
Something I picked up, I didn't listen to Melvyn Bragg's brilliant BBC In Our Time that you were talking about, but I looked at the Stanford University philosophy of encyclopedia entry.
Yes,
so it's
called SEP. SEP, yeah. I think it's called for short. Yeah.
And what came out there particularly for me was that there's so many different ways of even talking about what simplicity is. So simplicity isn't simple.
The complexity of simplicity.
Yes. Who would have known that simplicity could be so complicated?
Yes, it goes on for paragraphs. Really
as Winnie the Pooh said, I'm a bear of very little brain and I like to keep things simple. Winnie the Pooh would not have done well trying to get through the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on simplicity and Occam's razor.
Yeah. So when we think about, you talk about a multiplicity of things. So is it something simple when it's got the fewest things needed in its explanation? Or is it simple because it's got the fewest kind of things, or is it simple because it's a simple kind of explanation? It's an elegant explanation, is often used. So the classic example people always go back to is the Ptolemaic explanation of the universe, where the Earth was in the middle and the planets went around the Earth. And there were all these circles. Well, a circle is much simpler than an ellipse. That Kepler said, no, the planets go around in ellipse orbits, and yet, and then it's simpler to think that the Earth is in the middle rather than some other object. And then, as Kepler and then Newton came along, and lots of other people, we got to a much simpler explanation in terms of it just reduces to just a few of Newton's laws, the idea that the sun's in the middle, and all this complexity with these orbits of planets sort of appearing to go forwards and backwards as you look at the night sky, is all beautifully and elegantly explained in some very simple concepts. So
I mean, the point you're making, to correct me if I've got this wrong, is that ultimately what appeared to be a more complicated explanation was simpler. Would that be right?
Yeah.
Because we were, I mean, I'd agree with that. I mean, the apparent complexity of ellipses is needed because the simple explanation of circles won't fit with the evidence. So then you have to start making up ad hoc explanations to make the evidence fit to make your explanation fit the evidence.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that does generate more complexity than just saying, okay, well, you know, the circle idea was wrong. You know, it's ellipses, and that explains. And once we accept that, then the explanation for what we're seeing becomes a lot simpler.
If I'm not even following this, if anybody listening, they're going to think, what the heck's going on? So what, if you were to just sort of like somebody straight off the street and you would try and say, okay, once you're in the ballpark of saying defending Christianity or faith or God, what would be the simplest way of saying, oh yeah, we believe that we can sort of demonstrate God because of this argument? So what would you then say in the most simplest terms?
Well, I think let's see if we're ready to move on to that.
Right. Okay. Because, well, it's just that would be the start of why these terms even mean anything, apart from having a bit of understanding of Occam's razor.
Yeah. It's okay. Let's, Francis, if you talk about creationism, it's a simple idea that when you see all this massive diversity of life, that there was a designer who,
there we go. That's what I was after. Yeah.
On a boring day, thought, let's go for it.
Yes, and that is an easier explanation. You know, 7 days, bish bash bosh. Humans created all this range of things created. It did at one time appear to explain everything, but then the waters got muddied because geologists, even before Darwin came along, geologists could see from the layers of the earth when they did their excavations that it had to be older than could be accounted for by going back 6,000 years. There was some, but there was a bit of a problem about, how could we have this range of life? And then Darwin put forward a suggestion, which he had evidence to back up. And as the evidence piled up about the size of the universe, the age of the universe, the age of the earth, about how different types of things had existed going back into history, it became harder and harder to bat that evidence away and keep saying, oh no, 7 days, God, 6,000 years ago. And that ended up being the more complicated and the more demanding explanation, because it had to kind of fight back. It had to fight such a rearguard action against all the evidence that was building up in support of an old Earth with evolution having brought about the animal and plant life we see today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if that helps at all, Andrew. Is that?
Yeah, it's good if that kind of thing is okay, right? So you can sort of settle it in an example and say, okay, yeah, that's pretty good.
I mean, I suppose as an atheist, one of my go-to examples for me, obviously wouldn't work for a Christian, would be to say we don't need God. We don't need God to explain things. And if we can explain things without God, you know, it's a much more simple explanation just to look at the natural world and say that exists. We don't need to theorize about a spiritual, all-powerful creator, because we've got our explanation.
Something I like is the multiverse. So this is the version of the multiverse where there's lots of universes vaguely like ours in existence. That's surely not simple, because there's a proliferation of them, of all these universes. Isn't it simpler that there's just one? But you could say, well, there's whatever produced our universe. Isn't it odd that it only produced one? Isn't it simpler to think it produced lots? And then you think, well, wait a minute, what would the limit be on the number of universes it generated? And it's almost simpler to say there was no limit and it just generates infinite numbers of universes. So you get just right with simplicity arguments, not with arguments probably the wrong word. Simplicity consideration.
I leave that sort of thing to skydive Phil, because it's way above my pay grade.
Well, I mean, he talks about evidence. He doesn't talk about theory. But just on the simplicity theory, it's not necessarily a proliferation of things that Occam would balk at to say that the multiverse is a simpler idea than a single universe. Okay, so that's like an introduction to the whole idea. Now, does it point towards God is the question. And I stopped being a Christian and decided to look at it all from the outside in the 90s, and fairly quickly I was reading a book by Swinburne on giving evidence for God, and he loves Bayes' theorem, which Francis balks at. But on this, I thought it was one of the strongest things in his book, and I really quite liked it. So because we're looking for good arguments in favor of God, I want to sort of pick it up, because I think it's certainly worth considering.
Yes, if you can explain it to me, Ed, I'd be eternally grateful. Well, perhaps not eternally grateful, but I will be grateful. I'll be grateful for the next 45 minutes anyway.
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, so what he's doing here is using the cosmological argument, which is sort of, in layman's terms, why is there something rather than nothing? And, we look at the universe and it needs an explanation, or even a cause. We're not going to get into that. We're going to get into the sort of starting point of his Bayesian approach to it. And Francis, I really want to convince Francis that Bayes is a useful framework, because it's what lawyers use in court all the time without thinking about.
Yeah.
So the basic idea is you have a theory, like Bloggs is the criminal, and you then look at a certain piece of evidence, such as fingerprints on a knife, and if they are Bloggs' fingerprints on the knife, for example, you would say, okay, under the theory that Bloggs is the culprit, this particular observation is a really good fit. And so, given that there is fingerprints on the knife, it's much more likely that Bloggs is the culprit than the negation of that hypothesis. And so it's almost like we go with Occam without thinking about it. We go with this way of thinking without thinking about it. It's just that if you have a theory that's a really good fit to the observation, then you're much more likely to think the theory is correct. And this is where the dog ate my homework is a kind of useful way of thinking about it. So it's just inherently.
When you wrote that in the show notes, I thought you were accusing me of trying to use that excuse for not dealing with Swinburne myself.
Yes. So in maybe more seriously, in a court case, if the defendant says, "Well, the dog shot him, it wasn't me," that is, on the face of it, incredibly unlikely. So you've got to produce a massively good piece of evidence to make people even begin to treat it seriously, let alone think it could have happened. And that's because the prior is so small. But if the defendant comes up and said, well, he had a heart attack, that is something that is not inherently unlikely. It's quite the opposite if the person was of the right age and health and everything. So the prior for that theory is much higher. So that's what we're talking about with priors. So that's okay. So are you on board now as to roughly what's going on with all of this?
Yeah.
In terms of Bayes and using that kind of way of thinking to formulate an argument.
Just to add something interesting here, Richard Carrier used Bayes to highly strongly that Jesus didn't exist. And so with Swinburne,
did he put a number on it?
Huh? Sorry,
I believe he did.
Yes,
I think he did put a number on it, didn't he?
He did.
Oh,
he
no.
did. So you've got Bayes' theorem with a number that Jesus didn't exist, and Bayes' theorem with a number that he rose from the dead.
Well,
so that would make anybody who knows nothing about Bayes' theorem start to go, okay, tell me more. You know? So,
yeah. Well, it's a good computer program, but rubbish in, rubbish out.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it, because that just proves it. The very fact that Bayes can be used for both, it doesn't mean much. Yeah.
So it's a way of just putting a structure to what we intuitively do already.
Okay. Yeah.
So that if someone comes to court and said, "Look, it was this dog that shot him," everyone's saying, "Oh yes, you've got to have absolutely amazing evidence to convince me of that." And if someone comes to court and says, "Oh well, it was a heart attack," then it wasn't strangling or something. So, oh, okay, we'll hear you out. So that's really what's going on.
Yeah.
And it's at this stage that this simplicity comes in. So this is before we look at the observations of the universe or anything like that. We're asking, is it a kind of simple idea, and therefore much more likely to be true as we compare two explanations for the universe, basically. And here isn't, I don't mean our universe, I mean kind of everything that's covered by science and everything that exists, sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's in the field of not just observation, but kind of scientific study, and even beyond, but not kind of inventing new things. So Swinburne is using or appealing to, maybe not consciously, Occam in the way it's a simple kind of explanation, and it's got one entity, which is God. So there's let's start about where he in the book uses an analogy which I still remember. I haven't read the book for years. I still remember it really clearly. So you go to a house and there's a rake leaning up by the back door, and he says for that kind of thing there's two kinds of explanation: a personal explanation or a scientific kind of explanation. So a personal explanation would be, well, the gardener's gone in for lunch and leaned his rake against the door, and that's why it's there. A scientific explanation would need to be something like, well, there was a typhoon and it picked up the rake that was in a random place and plonked it just there in that exact place. So it's an explanation where it's clear, a condition where it's clear that the personal explanation is much more likely before we look at anything else than a scientific one or a natural one, you could say in this case. So then Swinburne jumps to say, okay, so we've got these two kinds of explanation. Trying to force everything into scientific is going to be very difficult. So let's take as the basic starting point two possible explanations for the universe, a personal kind of explanation and a scientific kind of explanation. And he argues that it's simpler to go for a personal one because there's just one entity, rather than a scientific one where whatever we just imagine, if we get some brute fact in our scientific work in 300 years time or 1,000 years time or whatever, is unlikely to be a single brute fact. It's likely to be lots of laws and things and how they interact, and so that's as far as we can go. You've just got to accept it. So it would seem that we would end up with a much simpler starting point as just a single entity God deciding to make all the complexity we have of the universe with all its laws and energies and all the rest of it. So that is really the aspect of it that I was impressed by. I'm not sure I've heard it since from anyone else. It's just this idea that a personal explanation actually has this feature of simplicity and elegance that we're unlikely to get from any other kind of explanation. When we're saying, well, for everything, why should it be? And then I can argue a bit why God is a simple idea. Okay, so you don't want to push back yet? I'll carry on.
No.
Okay. So it's again similar to this thinking about the multiverse, and if you've got one multiverse, one universe being generated, why not lots? And then, why lots? Why not infinite number? If you think of, okay, so any person, any God who's likely to generate our universe, it had to be extremely powerful to do that. So it's simpler to think of God as all powerful with no limits in his power than to try to think of some arbitrary limit of how powerful he is. So this sort of classical God of theism who knows everything and is all powerful is quite a simple. It's a very simple idea. No, I'm not saying God himself is simple. We're going to come on to that later, but it's a simple idea, and explains an awful lot from a simple idea.
Can I just throw some sort of bit of a side thing into this? It's funny because using this language, if people have listened to sort of apologetics in arguing for God, I've heard sort of language that I wonder how it blends with this, because when people have argued before in terms of making a case for God, they'll say, for example, funny enough, using the evolution one, and the ID people say the cell is just too complex. Okay, it's too complex, so God must be behind it. That's what you hear, but that's using language that's not saying something as simple. It's actually using the complexity argument of the cell for God. So how does, when you go over to one side to use that kind of talk, how do you then go over to the other side and use these sort of simple things, the language of simplicity as a defense of God? Do you see what point I'm making?
Well, I think those are two different things, because
it's just how do you blend them? I'm not saying they're the same thing.
I think what they'd say is that the simplest explanation for the existence of a complex thing is that it was created by a designer, and and to be fair, it is more complex to say, well, there were a series of events that were not designed, and that by this long series of events with things being created that fell by the wayside.
Yeah.
We've got to the point where a few of the many things that were created survive to this day and take the form they do now. It's not easier just to say, yeah, it was made like that. That was how it was designed, meant to be.
Right.
I don't know.
I see. So yes. So like if somebody just say, how did this happen? Oh, that's simple. God made it.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So exactly what you mean there. Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's how it would be blent. Even though you would actually say the cell is so complex, it couldn't be anything other than a divine action. Yeah.
Actually, I think evolution is incredibly simple. The kind of key ideas are simpler than Newton's laws. And
they are, but I suppose it gives rise to that question about when you talk about simplicity, there are various ways in which things can be simple, and I suppose you can see that it's not parsimonious to have this huge number of things that came into being, and 90% of them didn't make it, and we shake down to the lucky 10% who survived and who had the right qualities.
Well, I don't think that's a valid argument, because when you look at the solar system with all its moons of planets and things, it is very complicated, and yet it's come from some simple laws.
Well, I wasn't really intending it as an argument, because I agree with Occam, and I agree with whatever the scientists say about the planets, and I agree with evolution by natural selection. But I'm just sort of not quite playing devil's advocate, but I'm sort of saying why on one level you could see it as not simple, because it involves a cast of thousands. Whereas God's creation doesn't involve a cast of thousands. It involves, those were selected, they had these qualities. I mean, I agree, it's that Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection, if you understand it properly, and because so many people don't, is a very simple and elegant theory. And it does explain.
Yeah, that's the key point. It's elegant. So you've got this massive multiplicity of complicated organisms, which are all complicated in different ways. So it's complication upon complication, and it's elegantly explained by an incredibly simple set of ideas, which is wonderful in terms of Occam and that way of assessing things. So how do we think under theism? How does complexity arise? You've got to have a God who's reasonably complicated to be able to imagine all the complex possibilities to design.
I think so, wouldn't you? You would think that God would be complicated. And that's quite often an argument used by people pushing back on, for instance, the Kalam argument, and sort of saying, well, you're positing something that's even more complicated, even than what it's trying to explain. The explanation is more complicated than the thing it's trying to explain. But classical theists have an answer to that one, which is
that evil is the. Sorry, maybe I'm jumping. Evil is the absence of good. Is a.
Oh no, I was sort of thinking of that God is simple, but perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Yeah. The theory of God is simple is a definitely classical theist thing, which we're going to get onto. I was thinking about evil because it's our next point. because it's evil itself, it seems incredibly non-simple. That if God is simple, and he's sort of good, he's going to be all good, benevolent. Yeah, I don't manage to make it. And yet we've got to explain a world which is very complicated in the way of it not being all good. It's complicated in its design and the tentacles of an octopus and the design of a flea's eye or whatever, but the complexity of there being good and evil and in this strange mixture and what's all that about, to me seems an extremely difficult thing to fit into this simplicity idea. So if God is like, what's it like, bipolar, that's quite a lack of simplicity. And yet, why does he allow, well, not allow, but to kind of create a devil if there's going to be two gods fighting over the world?
Right, some kind of dualism, yeah.
So for Swinburne, he seems to have to end up in the idea that this has to be somehow the most kind of perfect world there is. I'm not sure if he actually puts it in those words, but he has a way of explaining evil that makes it sound like all evil is actually achieving great goods, that it would be logically impossible to produce those goods without the evil we have, which seems a fairly extremely extreme way of treating the problem of evil. Do you remember?
He's summing up by saying that actually, for one reason or another, which is the mystery of God, this is the best world that could be made.
Yeah, that's right.
With all that's in it. I mean, most people are just going to say, "What?"
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, wasn't that an idea that was originally put forward by Leibniz, that he said everything's for the best in this best of all possible worlds? I mean, he probably didn't say that. That's probably a bit like people summarize Occam's razor, that entities are not needlessly to be multiplied, but it kind of represents, I believe, that type of theodicy.
Has to go along with that, something like that. And he'd base it all on the idea that freedom is such a brilliant good that it can't be brought about without the level of evil and suffering that we have in this world.
Well,
do you remember him on
Plantinga? Plantinga's free will defense. The free will requires there to be evil in the world, and because God does not want to create automata who would always be good. Therefore, there is no alternative but to have a world. Logically, there is no alternative but to have a world in which there is evil.
Yeah. And Swinburne is going. I thought Plantinga is just opening the door to the possibility and saying that the logical deductive problem of evil argument can't work.
I think it's a bit more than that, because he says, for all we know, God may have sufficient reasons. But I think Plantinga does put forward a free will defense, but it doesn't really matter. I mean, I think we all understand the idea that
it's just how far they take it.
Whoever said it and to whatever extent, that the argument against the problem of evil is, well, in a world where people have free will, there will be evil.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there's no scope for real goodness, because real goodness can't occur unless people are free to choose to do the wrong thing.
Yes. Did anyone remember, this was years ago, Swinburne talking to Bart Ehrman on this?
Yes, topic? I heard that. Yep.
No, I didn't remember it. I might go back and listen to it.
It's quite shocking, because it's partly Swinburne's style that he is very kind of dry.
Well, it's ivory tower almost, isn't it? It feels like. Yeah. Well, it sounds like anyway.
He's quite chatty, but it is very ivory tower and behind it all. so when Justin says, "Hang on a minute, Richard, would you say that to a grieving mother?" And he said, "Oh, no. This is." You wouldn't say it in the moment, but we do have to think back and think about the world in a general way. So he's really trying to distance himself from that. But I think that reveals how what awful position he's in, and it comes across really badly with a combination of this ivory tower atmosphere.
Right. Yeah. Stuck away in Oxford somewhere or something like that, just trying to get come out when you've got an answer. We need one. Yeah.
Yes.
That's right.
And he ended up saying he brought up Godwin's War. He brought up the Nazis, not anyone else.
Yeah.
So I suppose he says, well, it always comes up, so I'm going to go there. And basically, the people who were killed were doing so for the good of others, in the same way that a soldier in World War I is killed, and it's for the good of the country, or maybe I should say World War One, just a just war anyway. If you imagine a just war, he says that the victims of the Holocaust were their lives meant something because they died for the sake of a greater good, and the greater good was this freedom thing. And basically, the people enjoying the good were the Nazi guards who were killing them because of
how were they? Sorry, I don't get that. Oh well, maybe
it was their freedom. The good they had was the freedom to be able to choose to do good or evil.
Oh,
and so that's how it ended up. That the whole world has this great good of being able to have freedom to do good and evil, and the main beneficiaries of this good, from the point of view of what the Jews were sacrificing, were the people killing them. And that's how it ended up. It's quite astounding.
Okay.
So why did he say that?
Because it's the logical. He just follows his ideas to their logical conclusion.
Right.
He's like that. He's you're going to respect him. He does explain things quite well, particularly people like Justin, and he doesn't kind of hold back from embarrassing conclusions.
Right.
I mean, he thinks it's good enough from his point of view. He's explained it okay.
About half.
Well, I do like Swinburne for his theory of moral, of ethical philosophy, because although he believes in God, he doesn't think that God is the basis for the existence of objective moral fact. So I like that about him.
Yeah.
Oh wow, I didn't know that.
No, he's very interesting on moral objectivism and how, in his view, it doesn't depend on God. It's completely independent of God.
Yeah.
Wow. Is it? You mean something that even God follows?
Yes. I mean, I guess he would say that, because he says that moral facts are logical facts. So because God is logical, I suppose, and because it's in his nature to do good, he would not do bad, but he doesn't dictate what's good or bad.
All right.
He knows what's good or bad because he's
wow, I'm surprised that people
omniscient.
Yeah.
But it's not, he doesn't make make things good or bad.
That's amazing, because you can imagine that God's, somebody asking God the question, why did you do this? Well, don't ask me. I mean, I'm just being good. I mean, that's what it makes me think of. I don't blame me. Look over there. And that's the way. In other words, it sounds like a bit like a Christian morality when they say the same thing. I'm not against homosexuality, but I have to follow what God says because He says it. For example, if you've believed that.
I mean, well, anyway, we're perhaps getting a bit
we need to do a podcast on that then. Morality outside of God.
I've always found that interesting about him. That he's a Christian, he's a very accomplished philosopher, and he says, there are objective moral facts, but not because of God. God doesn't make them objective moral facts; they're objective logical facts.
Wow. So well, that could bring humanists and God believers together.
Yep.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm holding back what I think is my strongest reason to not go with this approach by Swinburne on the simplicity argument. So he's saying all this complication of the world and the universe and scientific laws and everything, a person as an explanation is a much simpler way to go than a God kind of person with all these omni properties is a much simpler way to go than other ways. But what he's done is he has postulated a whole new realm of existence, a sort of God, a supernatural realm of existence that you don't need to. So you are generating a massive kind of person or kind of object, which you really shouldn't be doing if you're following Occam. You are it's much simpler to say, okay, let's try and explain the universe from what we know exists, not postulate something that we don't know exists and use that. It's a bit like the ad hocery of suggesting there's another. I think I forget what it was that when the Newton's laws didn't quite work, people did sort of postulated ad hoc things to try and make it work. But then the theory of relativity came along, and that was a much simpler way of making it all work. So in the same way, the theist is postulating something we don't know exists, before we look at the evidence, say for miracles or whatever. It's just a simpler idea to say, well, maybe the universe is all there is to understand, and not generate another thing outside of it that's created it.
Yes,
it's a whole different kind of existence
in trying to square an omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent being with what we actually see going on.
So cosmologists, for example, they see the Big Bang and everything, and they start looking for, within their laws of science and things, for how the Big Bang could have arisen. Was it for some prior thing, or was it, or what was going on? And so they're not looking for a completely different kind of explanation. They're sticking to their explanations from within science. And someone who came along and said, well, it's a completely different kind of thing with a different kind of causation, a non-physical causation or non-science kind of causation, they're going to sort of chuck that out like the dog shooting the victim in a court case. You say, well, that's so implausible. You're inventing something completely new. We'll just go with what we know to explain this. Is that good enough?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. I think that's...
So. Yeah, I think so.
That is covering this idea that simplicity points towards a God. So I'm saying it's a good idea, worth thinking about, but actually, in the end, probably it's either a kind of score draw, or it might point slightly that simplicity would suggest, well, let's just start with what we know exists, and that is the universe, and try and explain things from that, and find it more of an exotic explanation to jump to gods or ghosts or fairies or anything like that.
I've seen a couple of sort of videos on it, but can't imagine it. Certainly in my Christian background, it was nobody talked like this. You know what I mean? Even in evangelism or anything that we did when I was in Youth with a Mission, a Bible missionary organization, there was nothing like this in terms of this level of language and talk to try and talk to people. It was much more well, you must have had that, Ed, in your church, the evangelism to try and
yeah,
share was nothing of this level.
I was not interested in the simplest things like Arminianism versus
And
Calvinism, yes.
Yeah.
So you can imagine all this kind of thing was just nowhere near.
Yeah.
I think a little bit of apologetics came in evidence for the resurrection, and that's probably as far as it got.
I mean, it's they made a sort of joke on the video that you sent. We can put in the show notes. With the other guy, I forget his name, talking to William Lane Craig, and he says, "Well, I'll just quote you on that." And he turned to Jeremiah and read out a verse, and he said, the simplicity of God and the exact, using all this language, and it's just like it was just showing you that the language of the Bible, the prophets, and anything that's written in there is just so far removed from modern argumentation. So it's almost like a place and a time to talk in a certain way, and I wonder what the future will hold and what kind of language will be used. I think that the argument in the Bible is almost like the fool in his heart says that God doesn't exist or something like that, or there is no God. It's as simple as that. You're a fool. So it's not like, well, do you believe in the cosmological argument or whatever? So I tend to sort of come in from that realm. I find it sort of, for the average person, if it was convincing, you'd say, well, I don't understand anything that you've said, but sounds good, sounds complicated, and sounds like you're intelligent. So yeah, God must exist. That's about the nearest I can get to it.
Yeah.
Rather than sounding stupid, it kind of sounds like so much over your head that you think, well, there must be something to it. And until you get another Christian that says, oh, no, we don't agree with that. So then you start to get more confused again. Anyway.
So you listened to, okay, well, we're talking now about divine simplicity. Mm-hmm. And that is a thing that the early church fathers got into a bit, and then it was a real big deal in medieval Christianity of people like Aquinas and those sort of thinkers. It seemed to matter to them a lot, and they talked about it a lot. So you actually listened to at least 20 minutes or something of a philosopher and another philosopher called William Lane Craig talking about it. So did it make any sense to you at all?
I was sort of alluding to it just earlier. I think it was just like, I think that the whole level of discussion is just way beyond most people. So it's almost like an inner club of discussion. And I think that it's like intellectuals trying to meet intellectuals so that you're in that sort of realm. And I think that the average person is going to start to drop off with this kind of language, because I think it's almost like, I don't know, it's almost like going through a lot of doors to say something that you're not even necessarily asking. I mean, I'm not sure if I've even asked those questions, more related to Bible revelation and where they touch, it would perk my interest. But as an of arguments themselves, I would say, well, you need to really, I don't find it easy for myself to go, that's a very good point. It's a very, that really does push me towards God. It doesn't at all, because it's
Francis, did you get into this at all? This divine simplicity and these medieval philosophers and thinkers trying to get into it all?
Well, it's something that I have come across through the theories of various apologists. And it's not something that I've ever really felt. I sort of understand the words they're saying, but I don't understand why they're saying it. When they say something like, God doesn't exist, God is being itself, or God doesn't love us, God is love itself. Because the idea is that God is so simple, he has no parts, so he has no attributes. So he's not a loving God. He's not a God who loves us. He doesn't exist. He doesn't love us. He's love itself. He is being itself. I mean, I just sort of think being itself, what does that even mean? It's just like they went la 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 blah blah blah, and just prefaced it by God, and there we are. It's supposed to mean something. Am I being unfair?
Well, it's easy someone who doesn't understand something to dismiss it just like that, and we're all in the same boat, I think. I've had a go at trying to understand it, but it's not all that easy. It really isn't. So here are the 4 claims, apparently. of the traditional doctrine of divine simplicity. And number one is God is not distinct from his nature. So the idea is that you can call me, say, an engineer, and I'm distinct from that, from my nature. There's the concept of engineer and there's a concept of Ed. But you can't do that kind of thing with God, which is the sort of thing you were alluding to with that love thing. So that's one. Two is God's properties are not distinct from one another. So he's so simple and wonderful somehow that his property of being loving and his property of being all powerful are not somehow different things. It's all one thing. Okay, carry on. God's nature is not distinct from his existence. So that's another of this mind-blowing stuff that again you were onto. So I can have Voldemort can have a nature without existing, and some horrible dictator on earth can have a similar nature and exist. So the nature and the existence are two separate things, but with God it's somehow it's all wrapped up into one. And then God has no properties distinct from his nature. So you can't, as Francis was saying, you can't say God is loving distinct from his nature. It's just all one. Anyway.
So how would that reply to what Francis just said about what Swinburne said about morality being outside of God?
Yes.
I suspect Swinburne doesn't adhere to the doctrine of divine simplicity. I mean, I might turn out to be wrong, but I strongly suspect he doesn't.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's, I mean, William Lane Craig is really quite strong about it, saying not just that it's unbiblical, but he thinks it's virtually anti-biblical. And I mean, to me, it seems
he thinks what's anti-biblical.
What would I know? Perhaps I shouldn't claim to speak. But, you know, again, another aspect of simplicity is that isn't the simplest thing to look at the Bible and say, well, it says he changed his mind. And it says he got cross. And it said he loved somebody. You know, it said I mean, it just seems a lot simpler to interpret that as meaning what it seems to mean, rather than some hugely complex notion of simplicity.
I can hear the roar of fundamentalist Christians all over the world for saying that, Francis. That's what I mean.
Yeah, it seems if you're trying to say, well, God is simple, and that's a brilliant way of making a neat answer to the why we've got a world and all its complexity, it does fall apart when you have to sort of follow it through to this ridiculous extreme.
So what you were then saying, Ed, is you're saying God himself is simple in the sense that, you know, you were starting to get into the nature of God is not distinct from his existence. So what does that mean to the person listening?
I guess maybe we're much more familiar with the dilemma, Ephraim's dilemma.
Yeah.
And that is Christians don't like it because, they need to answer it, put it that way, because they feel they can answer us. Because they don't like the idea that God is good, and either you have an outside standard of goodness and you apply it to God, which is completely opposite of this God simplicity idea. Or God is good, and that's a sort of arbitrary, meaningless thing to say. So murdering someone is good if God commands you to, but God just happened to say, "Thou shalt not kill," so therefore it's not a good idea, and it's just an arbitrary what happens to comply with God is what's good and bad. And so you can't actually say God is good. You just say God is.
Would those people say that God can say something was good in the past, but now it's not good, and vice versa?
Yeah.
But would they say that? Because then you've got moral relativism within God. Well, you've got an explanation for it.
Yeah.
Slavery was once good; it's now not.
Well, God became a Christian. You remember that?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. I'm just wondering what they would say, because find most Christians want to have a consistent theme in everything they say, rather than it's wrong because it's always wrong, rather than no, God can drown men, women, and children, command his soldiers to put them all to death, but today he wouldn't do that and doesn't do that. They would say,
Yeah, I mean the usual horn of the dilemma that's taken is that I suppose particularly Christians say that there's a third horn that you can take, which is called modified divine command theory. So divine command theory is that something is good simply because God commands it.
Mm-hmm.
So if God commanded you to be homosexual, then it would be good to be homosexual. And modified divine command theory is the idea that, I mean, I think it was quite well expressed by William Lane Craig, that man again, WLC, who said, God doesn't command you to do things because those things are good. He commands you to do these things because he is good, which I think is quite a neat way of expressing
the point.
MDCT.
I think he goes further than that, because that sounds like the horn of the dilemma, which is saying there's this external to God standard of goodness that God complies with.
No, what he's saying is that he commands you to do things which are in accordance with his nature, and it is his nature to be good. I mean, I agree that my response to that is always, well, what do you mean his nature is good?
Yes.
Are you just saying his nature is as his nature is? But that's, I mean, it's like all of these kind of soundbite summaries of what somebody is saying. Yeah. William Lane Craig is trying to get across that God isn't trying to match up to some, he isn't looking at something and saying, here's action X, what is good over here? Well, okay, when I compare action X to what is good, I see that action X is good, or action X isn't good. There's no comparison. It is just that his own nature determines that he will order things in accordance with his own nature, and it is of the essence of his own nature that he is good, and therefore his commands will inevitably be good because they come. But they're not arbitrary.
Yeah,
I mean, there are certainly ways you can push back against this.
Well, what I want to say is, because it fits with the whole theme, what we're doing, is to say, well, you just kick the can down the road. Instead of saying these commands are good, you're saying my nature is good, and we're still needing an external measure of what goodness is and applying it to God in his nature, if not in his command. So it's just
well, I completely agree with you, but I mean, you will find.
But can you see where it's going in relation to today's discussion? It's forcing it towards this weird divine simplicity idea that we were trying to get our heads around. Because each time you kick the can down the road and do another nested layer of the onion of it's not God's commands that are good, it's God's nature is good. Well, but God's nature, you can't then say there's this external property of nature.
Yeah, so I mean that is where presumably the goodness itself.
So it all has to get wrapped up in some way that you can out.
Yes. I guess I can see that it's not that because God is goodness itself. What he commands isn't good because of any external basis. It's good because it comes from goodness itself. Therefore, it must be good. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and that it's a driver for why this weird divine simplicity idea should need to be postulated.
I was just wondering how this is going to then relate to Christian thinking in terms of defense of God, and meant to be drawing and gleaning from the Bible in the first place, in many, certainly for Protestants, if not wider with church history for Catholics, and Eastern Orthodox, but the Bible tends to be the sort of grounding of where we even get any ideas meant to define certain Christian truths. And so in this area, it seems to be that everyone could have this discussion without mentioning the Bible once. So
or the Trinity.
So and anything else. And so this is like a discussion of theism as opposed to Christianity or Islam or Judaism. It's just there's a being, and these are the arguments for it philosophically, or one of many arguments for it philosophically. If there was a God, it would be like this. But isn't that getting the cart before the horse? Because Christian tends to be, let's turn to the Word of God and find out stuff.
Yes. So is the God of the Bible simple? Is he a sandwich short of a full picnic? Or maybe we're not talking about that kind of simple.
Yeah, I was talking, let me put it as simply as this.
Okay, try.
And I was talking to Francis off air earlier about this, that when I went to theological college, I was actually shocked to obviously grow up in evangelical church, sort of quite fundamentalist, but also progressives as well, and moving on that way. I was actually shocked at the language of theology compared with the language of the Bible. So that you'd have to go to be a Swinburne or go into college and study to go. Yeah, you don't really understand the Bible because it doesn't mean hardly anything what it looks like, and that's basically what I felt like when you studied certain theological things. Like, for example, I've got the definition here of something that I didn't even know the terminology before I went to theological college at this level, and that was something called the impassibility of God. And I thought, okay, what's that? And it's God doesn't have passions. So it's like, well, that's crazy. I mean, I've just read Exodus so and so, and God gets enraged and full of wrath and anger, and we've talked about this.
Yeah, it goes on his anger management course.
I'm talking about that. That would be the passions and wrath of God, and being affected was the most natural way of reading the character. No, there's not as if anybody who believes in the impassibility of God doesn't know about these passages, but it's just that they then have to have a whole sieve to then tell the average reader that what you're reading is just it's over in this area, not this area, because God is really impassible. It's called the impassibility of God. It's a theological mainstream doctrine, which was a shock to me to actually have words like that. And then so I'll just read the definition of the immutability and impassibility of God. Immutability means that God does not change in any way. Impassibility, which is related to immutability, means that God does not experience emotional change in any way. He does not suffer. And you're thinking, well, God was in Christ suffering, and God seems to get angry. He seems to have emotions. He seems to react as many people read the Bible. So basically, and pretended that he may change his mind. There's sort of passages that talk about, you've got to start somewhere with the Bible, even if you're going to say none of it means what it says or means what it sounds like. You could at least start by reading it, and you get these passages that say God is going to wipe everyone out except for Moses, and Moses steps in and says, but what about the nations? What will they think of you? You promised it. Oh, right. Okay, well, we'll perhaps stick to plan A then. This language makes any reader at first think, okay, God is like this, so you certainly wouldn't have impassibility come up as a way of describing God. I mean, if you said to Moses, God doesn't get, just read that out. God, by the way, you're talking to God there, but he doesn't change in any way. He doesn't suffer. He doesn't have any passions. Moses would go, probably have him struck down. So I'm just thinking in that line. And so when you've got all of that narrative of the Old Testament of God you just have to say, well, what does that mean if God is actually truly impassible and immutable? You read it all in a line, as Augustine said, as he was going that way in theology, saying that all of that language in the Old Testament is God lisping. It's like goo goo gaga to kids when you're an adult. If you start speaking in baby language to a toddler, any other adult will know that that's not your general wisdom and and knowledge. That you're coming down to the level of the toddler at their understanding of any form of communication, and that's how people do it in theology. They say, so when you read all these Old Testament passages, you don't think, you're not meant to think that somehow it's communicating something about God, but actually God is nothing like that. So that's what I would say that is done here.
So God's nothing like he's said to be in the Bible.
Yes,
what is he like then?
That's right. What is he like then? Well, he's impassible, and he's like what? The funny thing is that he's actually quite similar to some Greek concepts of God. And so one would have to think that, there's certainly evidence in probably some evidence pre the New Testament times, from the Greek sort of period, Plato and stuff, coming through into church Christian beliefs. Immortality of the soul was one of them. Bible talks the same thing. Bible talks about souls that die and death, and that man is mortal, and then suddenly there's the immortality of the soul coming from Greek philosophy. So it happened, changes of language. So God is passible in the Bible, but the God becomes impassible in theology. And so I noticed this in a lot of my studies, and you just realize that the God of Aquinas, for example, way later in church history, is not the God of the Bible, and yet it became the God of the Bible. And therefore, when you read the Bible, you read lisping language, and that's how you. But the average church, see, in your church, Ed, back then in the day, do you think any of them thought that God was impassible and immutable?
No.
In reality,
think we were much more familiar with the Old Testament than we were with any of these ideas.
Right. Or even just the way Christians talk. I was speaking to the Lord this morning, and he said to me, and you would say, well, theologically, that's nonsense. He knew what you were going to say before you even made the universe. He's responded already. He's outside of time. He's eternal now. He's not, so the way we even talk as Christians doesn't even fit theology, because you're like this little speck of ordained knowledge in God's mind that was always there. And so how do you relate to this? It's like relating to a stone. How do you relate? Whereas the Bible does seem to talk about God as at least relatable, if not angry and loving, compassionate and full of wrath and changing and responding to prayer. I mean, if you're really into prayer, you would tend to think that prayers do something that might not have happened, but that's not the way Calvinists and many Christians actually talk about it. So so that's some of my fiery words on it.
Yes. And it's a wonderful passage with Moses bargaining with God. I think it says Abraham does it in Genesis, and then Moses does it later on. And it's all portrayed as if that's really happening
in time. I mean, the talk about God being outside of time, you could possibly say, because God is not really a character in the New Testament, you can read into that sort of just talk about God as all of these omniscient, and you can probably do that with the New Testament, because God isn't a relating character. But maybe some hints, the way Jesus talks to, say, the Father, you would say, well, it just seems if that's a genuine conversation, it's happening. The conversation didn't happen before, and it's now you've had it, and then God is doing something else. So the idea of God being in time throughout the whole lot seems to be, there's a period where he's working with or making Adam and Eve, and there's a period where he's with Abraham, period right the way to the prophets, period to Jesus' time, and you're thinking that's our time. And then the theology is that God is outside of all of that, in some cases ordained everything, and it's like a film, and it doesn't, but time sequence seems to be a very common element in the Bible, sequence of events, even with God.
And I think the Trinity is a real problem if you're trying to say that God is simple. Because
well, no one can even understand the Trinity.
It's not just difficult to understand. It's just that I'm one person. That makes me much simpler than God, just right there.
You would think, wouldn't you?
Yes, but I've got all sorts of parts and things, but God is three separate people and one person.
You see, I thought he was one being. I thought he was three persons and one being.
But that's so hard to understand in itself.
I agree. I mean, it's another case where it's just the words are like white noise to me. You know, I mean, I understand each specific word, and I see that they have a grammatical structure that complies with the requirements of our language, but the end result is just blah, 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 blah.
Well, it's like sitting on the corner of a round table. It's the same. Yeah. It sounds like a sentence that's grammatical, you know, or it's a four-legged tripod. You know what I mean? So that's what you're saying. And so, but even the incarnation, in terms of what I've said about sequence, I used to think about this. I was thinking about, and we've talked about this with Ed before, with slightly different view of what it means. But certainly from my Christian background, God was God in the Old Testament. He sort of came down somehow as an aspect of him, part of him, whole of him, whatever it was, became incarnate in Jesus. Jesus ascended in a body into the right hand of the Father, somewhere in this other dimension. And he wasn't like that before. It's like, you know, you go back. So you're thinking, okay, so how does the eternal now, the God that is everywhere, the other, everything, infinite, how is Jesus always a body sitting at the right hand of God? And yet you're up there in that realm. You're not saying, oh, well, that's on earth. You know, that's fine. You can say there's bodies on earth. But if there's a body in heaven, and if there's angels in heaven, so-called, who rejoice when people repent or whatever, you know, the angels rejoice when you're thinking, okay, if they hadn't rejoiced before, they might not rejoice until later. So that's sequence. So that's the only way we can get our minds around it. So it's like, I just don't understand how the incarnation can fit into this simplicity. Would you say that, Ed? Or
yeah, of course, yeah. And I think, well, William Lane Craig is dismissive of Aquinas' attempts to try and make it all work. Right.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, this whole lot is all about trying to make something work from a premise that may not be true in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's like, you know. Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? I like that thing that Robert, I think I told you this ages ago, another podcast, but Robert M. Price quoted some lecturer and somebody says, I really don't understand the Trinity. What does the Trinity mean? It means sit down and shut up. Because it's like, at the end of the day, that's what you feel you're told when you ask a question. But I don't understand. Just sit down and shut up. It's the doctrine of the church.
Yes. Yes. And I thought you said you were going to do, I was expecting you to do the other one, which is, what tangled webs we weave.
Oh, that's another one.
When at first we seek to believe.
Well, no. He changed it
to believe.
What a tangled web we weave when first we practice to believe, and that was brilliant. And now I think the phrase is
Price as well.
That was Price, yeah. I loved it. I absolutely loved that. And it was like, wow, yes, because the Swinburnes and the William Lane Craigs are the end result of when we first practiced. What we first practiced?
What a tangled web we practice to
believe. Web we weave. That's right. Yes. So this is a tangled web because everybody goes somewhere different. They all fall out with each other, but the tangled web is created because we practice to believe. And so without believing, you don't get in these tangled webs. Now you might have your own agnostic, atheistic kind of tangled webs yourself. That's fine. But at least I think this is what's happening. And it throws the most intelligent people to these different extremes because we practice to believe. It's like, I've had an experience of God. I know he's loves me and he's saved me, changed my life. So now let's go away and get the answers. It's post that, isn't it? And so and these extremes may just make people's heads go, what are you saying? You know, just like other ones we've had, like what the biggest one I'd never heard of until only a few years ago was the one you like it talking about. It's the one where God hides. What's it called?
The hiddenness of God.
The hiddenness of God. Yeah. No, there's another term as well. Josh is into that as well.
Skeptical theism.
Skeptical theism. Yeah. I mean, this is like, it's like, you know, you get some people to say, look at the evidence for God. It's all in nature and God is self-evident because of this, this, and this. And then you say, well, what about this? Well, that's when God's hiding from us, and it's like, okay, so which is it? Is he hard to find, or is he easy to find? Give me something. If you like consistency, try to stay in it, please. That's what I think. Otherwise, you think, this person's question. We'll go over to skeptical theism to answer you. This is another guy asking another question. All right, so we'll go over to God is found in just looking at the nature of the world, and God is self-evident. Okay, and two different kinds of theology there. Okay.
I think we're there. I think we were right.
I think we're there. Yes, I think. Yeah. If anybody, we may have started off with 3 listeners and left with 1, but I hope. I do. I must admit, and I think I've said before, I find these areas a bit just. I sort of experience it like as if I was listening to a podcast and thinking, what are they talking about? And so if that's the case with something like this, it just shows you that it's probably a very fraction of people that really would benefit from it in one way or another, I think, compared with other areas. Anyway, so well, I'm sure that we will find something a bit more graspable,
accessible, yes,
all right, about and accessible. So we'll go from the perfect episode to the simple episode to the accessible episode next time. So until next time, so do tune in, if to use the old language of radio, in about a month's time for the next episode, which might be on what, Ed? And we don't really know yet, do we?
Yeah, we haven't decided.
We haven't ordained anything here. Okay. So until next time then, Doubts Aloud listeners, I have been Andrew, your host.
I've been Frances.
And I've been Ed, and goodbye.